Thanks for joining us today. We would love to hear how God is using this ministry in equipping you to live, move, and be in the fullness of Christ. Please take a minute and email us your story at info@victorychurch.tv. To learn more about this message and others, visit our website at victory.church. Thanks again for joining us. We hope you enjoyed today's message.
Well, hello, Victory Church. I hope everyone's doing great today. Are you glad to be in the house? Amen. Well, we're glad and honored that all of you are here today. I want to greet those of you watching online right now. Thank you for tuning in. And now we are streaming live on Facebook. And so everybody on Facebook right now getting on, welcome. We're honored to have you with us streaming live on Facebook. And just excited that you're here. I literally have to kind of control myself or contain myself when I come to the stage during the series, because I just feel during worship, I just feel like I'm about to explode. And then I have to get my composure for the stage. And so I'm just excited about what God's doing here in this series and in this church. There's just a spirit of an atmosphere of expectancy. The Holy Spirit is moving and doing amazing things. And we're just excited for where God's going to take us in 2017. And we believe that this series, Make Room, is foundational to where God is taking us. Week 1, we talked about that we're going to make room for growth. That God wants to grow us. He wants to expand us as people, and we got to prepare for that. Week 2, we talked about that we're going to make room for a burden. And nobody ever wants to pray for a burden, but we begin to realize that there are some burdens we're not called to carry, and then there are other burdens, God-given burdens, that we are called to carry. And when we ask God for a burden, what we're doing is we're believing that when we take on a God-given burden, His blessings and His mercy and His favor and everything comes with it. Last week, Oscar brought the house down and brought an amazing word and encouraged us by reminding us that we ain't seen nothing yet, that God is just now getting started. And so we're excited about what's going on here today in this series. And today I'm going to bring a message that kind of piggybacks off what I talked about in week 2 of make room for a burden. Why? Because I believe that when we make room for a burden, something else comes automatically. And if we're not prepared for it, we'll get all excited about the burden, but when the burden comes, well, it kills us or it defeats us. And so what I want us to do today is we're going to make room for something. If you thought that making room for a burden sounded sad and depressing, I want to encourage you today, because in 2017, we're going to make room for a battle. Because anytime you make room for a burden, you should know that when you make room for a burden, then a battle's coming right behind it. But we'll understand and we'll come to know that that's not necessarily a bad thing. That in the same way that with the burden came a blessing, we'll begin to discover that in the battle comes some great things too. And so what I want to do is take us to the life of a man in the Bible who really lived this out. And really what we do is we go to the scriptures to find people who've already lived out what we're about to live out, or what we are living out. And we figure out how they overcame their obstacles. And so I want to look at the life of Gideon. Gideon's a man who walked through this idea of having to make room for a burden. He had to make room for growth, and he had to make room for a battle that he never wanted to fight. And so I want to introduce you to this man Gideon in Judges chapter 6, verse 11. It says this, it says, "Then the angel of the Lord came and sat beneath the great tree of Ophrah." Not Oprah. She's not quite that old. I'm sorry. "Which belonged to Joash of the clan of Abiezer. Gideon, son of Joash, was threshing wheat at the bottom of the winepress to hide the grain from the Midianites. The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, 'Mighty hero, the Lord is with you.' 'Sir,' Gideon replied, 'if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? And where are all the miracles our ancestors told us about? Didn't they say the Lord brought us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and handed us over to the Midianites.' Then the Lord turned to him and said, 'Go with the strength you have and rescue Israel from the Midianites. I am sending you.' 'But Lord,' Gideon replied, 'how can I rescue Israel? My clan is the weakest in the whole tribe of Manasseh, and I am the least in my entire family.' The Lord said to him, 'I will be with you, and you will destroy the Midianites as if you were fighting against one man.'" I want to encourage you. I want us to be a church or a house of people who take notes. That's why we give pens in the seat backs. I want you to burn the ink out of that thing. Because we want to be a people who is constantly learning. We are a learning people. We never stop learning. I don't care if you're 8 or 80. We learn over and over. So I want to encourage you to write down the title of this message, put it in your phone, write it down somewhere, and I want you to write this down. This thought is that troops cannot triumph in the trenches. Troops cannot triumph in the trenches. This idea came to me the other day whenever I was watching a documentary. I love documentaries. I love history. I really love documentaries about war, World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, all those things. I just love it. I soak it up. And I was watching this documentary on World War I, and they begin to talk about warfare and the battlefield. And I begin to see all these beautiful symbolisms between what it's like on the battlefield in war and what it's like in the life of a Christ follower, because we're in the battle, we're in warfare. And they begin to talk about World War I, and they talked about how World War I became known as a war that was fought in the trenches. Trench warfare is what they called it. And I want to read this one historian put it this way. A historian wrote, he said this: in the summer of 1914, soldiers had set out for a swift war. But after several difficult and extremely bloody months, to better protect themselves, Allied forces burrowed a line of trenches that stretched some 500 miles long, from the North Sea through France to Switzerland, where they would dig in for 3 years. And we got to understand that we're going to battle. And in the same way that we find our greatest blessings in the midst of God's biggest burdens, we need to understand that when it comes to warfare, that we find that when we fight life's toughest battles is where we find our greatest victories. And if we aren't willing to go to battle, then we'll never discover victory. We'll never taste what it feels like to be victorious if we're never willing to go on the battlefield in the first place. And this war, this World War I love how the historian wrote. He said that they set out for it to be a swift war. This war in World War I, the reason they dug the trenches was because it was one of the first wars where machine guns were introduced. The artillery had changed. And when they experienced death and pain, to get away from the artillery, to get away from the things that were coming to harm them, they dug trenches. They dug trenches. And what was supposed to be a swift war, what was supposed to be painless and try to have as few casualties as possible, became something that was drawn out over years to come with millions upon millions upon millions of deaths. One of the most bloody battles in all of history. And I wonder how some days that this is similar to us in our walk with Christ, that we have been hurt, that we've experienced pain, that we've experienced artillery in battle that we've never faced before, and we don't know how to overcome it. And instead of looking to God for the strength we need to fight the battle that He has placed us in, we dig trenches. And what was supposed to be a swift war, with God's help, what was supposed to be us getting over our unforgiveness, what was supposed to be us getting over our bitterness, has become something that we've now dug a trench, and something that was supposed to be swift has now taken root in our hearts, and we live it out day after day, and we cover it up with addiction and ailments, and we blame others, all of these things. Why? Because we've dug a trench to protect ourselves. And that's what I want to talk about today, because I believe that Gideon shows us a perfect example of a man who had dug a trench, who was supposed to be on the battlefield, and God would have made it a swift battle. But instead, he was hiding in a wine press, at the bottom of the wine press, somewhere he didn't belong. And we need to understand that he had his own trench that he was called to get out of. And really what I want us all to understand is that I'm not just preaching to a few of us. Every single person under the sound of my voice is in a trench of some kind, myself included. Whether we know it or not, whether we realize it or not, we all are entrenched in a way of thinking, in a way that we live our lives that is keeping us from getting on the battlefield to do exactly whatever it is that God is calling us to do. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at the life of Gideon. We're going to go through some things that the trench represents, and I'm going to show you how toxic the trench really is. And then we're going to look at some things that the trench is not. And then what we're going to do is we're going to look at Gideon and say, if Gideon got out of his trench, I can get out of mine too. And so I'm going to look at Gideon's life and say, what did Gideon do? What did God do in Gideon's life to empower him to get back on the battlefield for whatever it is that he was called to do? So the first thing I want to talk to you about is this, is that the trench is a place of fear. The trench is a place of fear. Really, what drives us to the trench in the first place is fear. We become fearful on the battlefield, and so to overcome our fear, we dive into what we think is a place of safety. And one of the things that I just got wrapped up in and ended up doing it for hours upon hours is I began to read the journals of these warriors. There's all of these journals online of these men who were in World War I who would be in the trenches writing because they had nothing else to do because they weren't fighting. So they would write and they would journal. And every single one of them focused in on the fear. Every single one of them spoke about the fear and the anxiety and all the things that would come on them while they were in the trenches because they could not identify where their enemy was or what their enemy was doing. They didn't have a view. And they knew if they tried to get out there to pursue their enemies, they would be knocked off. And so they were just left in their trench to worry and to have fear. And what many of them came to understand is that the fear inside the trench was even greater than the fear outside the trench. And they were overcome with fear. Many of them talked about how nighttime was the most fearful. At nighttime, that fear would just overtake them because they could not see. They could not see. And we can relate to this because the same refrigerator that runs all day long, when it kicks on at 1 a.m, it's like, oh my gosh, what was that? Did a truck just drive through the front door? Why? Because night and darkness has this way of gripping us with fear, and they would talk about this. And then they begin to talk about how fear bled into the next stage. And this fear we see happening in Gideon's life. In verse 11, it says this. It says, Gideon, son of Joash, was threshing wheat at the bottom of the winepress. Why? To hide. He was hiding. Fear from the Midianites had driven him to do something in a place. You're not supposed to thresh wheat in a winepress. But he was so fearful, he was driven by fear, that he did something that he was supposed to be doing one place and he was doing it in another because he was so gripped by fear. And this fear will overtake you, and the fear will then take you into this other thing. And the trench is also a place of paranoia. Soldiers would write in their journals about how the darkness and the fear and the unknown would drive them into this sense of paranoia. And everything was the enemy. Everything became a potential hazard. Everything became a potential sniper. Every sound, every moment of every day bled and poisoned their minds with this idea of paranoia that then led them into the next stage where the trench becomes a place of confusion. It becomes a place of confusion. Because the fear would drive them to paranoia, and the paranoia would drive them to a place of confusion. One soldier wrote this. He said, the barrage of artillery fire and explosives in the trench and constant sniper fire gave rise to the term that the soldiers are beginning to call shell-shocked. The trauma, the mental breakdown suffered by many of the soldiers is unbearable. And this paranoia would begin to take shape, so much so, this confusion, that they would begin to shoot each other. That every sound, every crack of a twig, everything became the enemy. And so what would happen is, now listen, historians they differ on how many casualties they actually think there were in World War I. Some say 7 million. There's just all these different figures. There was millions upon millions of deaths in World War I. But most historians agree that nearly 20% of all the casualties came from friendly fire. Friendly fire. Where they would get so paranoid that they would shoot to friendly trenches. And I just wonder how much so this is prevalent in our walk. Because the Baptists are shooting at the Presbyterians, and the Pentecostals are shooting at the Methodists, and before we know it, we become so toxic and paranoid that instead of shooting the enemy who comes to kill, steal, and kill and destroy, we shoot at each other on Facebook. We shoot at our own church. We fire upon friendlies, and we begin to fight one another. Before you know it, we're shooting at each other, and the enemy is over there laughing at us because he's not having to do any shooting. We shoot each other. And this is something that began prevalent in the war. And I just wonder how often we do this. The other thing that the trench represents is that the trench is a place of exposure. Now, you wouldn't think that. You would think the trench would be a place of safety because you're not exposed to the fire. You're not exposed to the machine guns and to the snipers. But what the soldiers begin to realize is they drove them to the trench for safety. But what they begin to realize over a period of time is that the trenches were exposing them to things that were in some ways more harmful than the snipers. Because they were exposed to things that were happening more slowly. I began to read about the trenches and the toxicity, and they begin to try to describe the nastiness of these trenches. You try to describe a place of mud and water and filth and thousands of men living and feces. I know it gets gross, and feces and decomposing bodies. They said that the rat infestations, that there's rats larger than cats roaming the trenches, and they would feed on the decomposing bodies, and they would feed on the living bodies. And what happened is they began to be exposed to things like malaria and influenza and things that were slowly killing them. They were exposing themselves to toxic things in the trenches, so much so that there began to become things that never even existed until the trenches existed. There was a disease that came about that they named trench fever. There was a disease that take root in the trenches, then they named it trench foot, because they would walk up and down the trenches in the water, and their feet would literally, the flesh would begin to rot from their feet, and they called it trench foot. And all of these things that would begin to happen, why? Because they were exposed to something harmful. Now, it's one thing to be exposed to sniper fire and artillery, but sometimes it's even more dangerous to be exposed to something that you don't even know is killing you until it's too late. And many times, because we're hurt, because someone has done something to hurt us, because a spouse or a loved one or a father did something, or a friend did something to hurt us, we dive into the trench for safety. We build walls to protect ourselves for safety. But what we don't understand and what's happening is that, yes, we have removed ourselves from the immediate sniper fire, but in our trench is when bitterness begins to take root. In the trench is where unforgiveness goes down deep inside of us. And what we thought was a place of safety is actually a place that the enemy uses to kill you slowly without you even realizing it. And it began to become so much more alive in me and understanding these beautiful similarities and these beautiful symbolisms, because we expose ourselves to these things in the trenches of our mind and this mindset and these thinking. And we say, my first spouse did that to me, and I will never let anybody ever get close to me again because I never want to feel that pain again. We go into the trench. We go into the trench. And in the trench, we expose ourselves to toxic thinking. In the trenches, we expose ourselves to bitterness and unforgiveness. In the trenches is where we cover the pain with addiction. In the trenches is where, in order to protect myself from ever feeling that pain again, even if it's fake, even if I have to manufacture it, I will mask the pain. I will mask the hurt with addiction. I knew it'd be quiet in here. That's okay, I prepared myself for it. John, why do you keep bringing these heavy sermons? Because the church has had enough rah, mamsy-pamsy church. Look, we got to deal with our issues so we can get back on the battlefield. Yes, we need encouraging, and that's why we got Oscar around. Oscar come in and encourage us. No, I'm just kidding. But we have to be encouraged to get off our tail and to get back in the battle. So in the trenches, and I believe that Gideon was exposed to these elements in the trench. And he began to have a toxic way of thinking. And you know what's crazy about Gideon is he was in a trench that he didn't even dig. Now watch this, I want to show this to you in verse 11. I bet you missed it when I read it the first time. It says, then the angel of the Lord came and sat beneath the great tree of Ophrah, which belonged to Joash. Now who's Joash? Well, it goes on to say, Gideon, son of Joash, was threshing wheat in the bottom of the winepress to hide from the Midianites. He was hiding in a trench that didn't even belong to him. I wonder how many of us found ourselves in a trench that our fathers dug. How many of us find ourselves in a place of depression or loneliness or bitterness or unforgiveness that we didn't even put ourselves in? That our grandfather did something that was passed down from, and many of us wake up in the trench. We've never experienced life outside the trench because we were born in the trench. And we got to understand that whether we dug the trench ourselves or whether we woke up in a trench, it's time to get out of the trench because we are calling and we're making room for battle. We're going to make room for battle in 2017. Keep going. So the trench is also a place of isolation. Trench is a place of isolation, and the enemy uses this. Oh my gosh. So what was happening in World War I is they had the front lines, and then they had back where they had the reserves, where they had the medicine, where they had the food, where they had all of the things that the frontline men needed. But what they began to write about in their journals was that they had difficulty getting the supplies to the front lines where they were needed. Why? Because they were isolated. They were cut off. And they had the very things they needed to make them better. Have you ever met somebody that's bitter? And you try to help them, and they build a wall? Have you ever known somebody like that? That you have what they need. You have the Jesus that they need, but they've become so isolated that they're hard to reach. You know anybody like that? That's hard to reach. Doesn't matter what you say, there's bitterness. Doesn't matter what you say, they don't believe anything you have to say about Jesus. And Gideon was isolated. I want to prove it to you. Watch this in verse 13. Sir, Gideon replied, if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? And where are all the miracles our ancestors told us about? Didn't they say the Lord brought us up out of Egypt? Watch. But the Lord has abandoned us. Gideon was hard to reach. God sent an angel to Gideon. And he's still like, I don't believe any of this junk. God abandoned us a long time ago. I'm in my trench. If I wasn't in my trench, I would maybe believe that God had, but I'm in my trench. I'm here hiding, having to do things in hiding because God abandoned us along. Have you ever been around people like this? They're hard to reach. They're hard to reach. They're in a trench. So we have to understand and identify the trench. We have to understand what is present in the trenches, but we also have to understand what the trench is not. Okay? So number one, the trench is not a place of permanent residence. It's not a place of permanent residence. Now, let's not just get all hasty about the trench because the trench has its benefits. The trench isn't all bad. If you're in the battlefield and you run out of ammo, you need a place to dive in and reload, don't you? If you're in the trench and you get shot, you need to dive. If you're on the battlefield and you get shot, you need to be able to dive into the trench and get some medical care. You need to dive into the trench and eat some food and get fed so you can go back out onto the battlefield. And so what happens is the trench isn't necessarily a bad thing. When you go through divorce, man, dive in the trench. Surround yourself with your pastors and your friends and go to a counselor. Feed yourself with the Word of God. When you're hurt, when you have someone betray you, when something happens in your life that's harmful to you, dive into the trench. But we need to understand that the trench is not a place of permanent residence. Why? Because number two is that the trench is not a place of victory. That's why it's not a place of permanent residence, because it's not a place of victory. No war has ever been won from the trenches alone. Why? Because in order to win, you have to take ground. You have to go into the enemy's territory. And you can never move, you can never go into the enemy's territory without first leaving your place of residence. And the scary thing about this is that we are fighting against the enemy. Listen, your spouse is not your enemy, okay? Your boss is not your enemy, okay? This Facebook's not your enemy. None of those things. The devil is your enemy. He is your adversary. And so we have to understand that we're fighting against an enemy that's not in his trench. Now, in World War I, it's understandable. Okay, they're in their trench, we're in our trench. It's a standoff. The devil's not in his trench. Why do you say that, John? Because 1 Peter 5:8 says, stay alert, watch out, for your great enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for somebody to devour. And here we are hiding in our trenches, shooting at each other, while the devil takes ground for our country, while the devil takes ground in our families, while the devil takes ground in our churches. Why? Because we're so fearful, we're so paranoid, we're so hurt, we're so exposed that we just hide. And the devil's up just taking territory all around us. Why? Because we aren't stepping out of our trench to fight. So we've become entrenched in the way of our thinking. I want to just acknowledge the fear. You know, it's easy for us to sit in 2017 and say, yeah, why didn't these sissies get out of the trench and fight? I mean, come on. Well, it's interesting because as I begin to study this, the Allied trenches and the enemy's trenches, in some places they were as narrow as 50 yards apart. And we're thinking, 50 yards? Are you kidding me? That's like the size of this auditorium. Just get up and run across it. Take land. You're only 50 yards away from victory. And we look at addicts and alcoholics and say, are you kidding me? Just get on your feet, get some help. But we can't underestimate the fear. It's real. The soldiers begin to call the space 50 yards, they called it no man's land. No man. Why? Because no man has ever gone in there and ever came back. Ever. Because there's snipers, there's landmines, there's artillery. And so we can't, listen, I don't sit here and try to pretend like your pain's not that bad and just suck it up and move on and come on, get out of your trench. I'm not here doing any of that. I can't even begin to comprehend some of the pain that's in this room and watching on Facebook and watching online. People that have been raped, people that have been abused, people that have had the worst of the worst happen to them. I don't discount that, okay? I don't discount that. It's no man's land. I get it. So then what are we left with? Do we just stay in the trench? Well, I believe that's what the scriptures are for. The scriptures are there so we can look at the lives of other people and see how they got out of their trench. So let's go to Gideon. Let's figure this out. So Gideon, God did some things in Gideon's life. So let's look at this. Number one, God gave Gideon a new name for the battlefield. A new name. In verse 12, it says, the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, mighty hero, the Lord is with you. Now, when I read that, I'm like, mighty hero? Really? God, he's a pansy. Like he's the biggest chicken of all. And he admits it. He's like, I'm from the least of the tribes and I'm the least of my family. Gideon himself would tell you that that's a joke. So why did God choose to label him as a mighty warrior? I believe that God chooses to label him as a mighty warrior because he doesn't base us on our present condition. He bases the way he calls us on the son that he sent to die on our behalf, that we live victorious. So he doesn't call us what we currently are. He calls us based on the potential that's locked up inside of us of who he's calling us to become. And so we can begin to call ourselves not based on the reality of the situation, but based upon who God is calling us to become. Let this be a lesson for all of us to stop abusing yourself, stop telling that you'll never be able to accomplish anything. I don't have the right education. I don't have the right upbringing. I wasn't born on the right side of the tracks. Start saying, I am a conqueror. I am a good father. I am good with money. I can get the promotion. We begin to call ourselves not based on our feelings. Anybody can do that. We begin to call ourselves based on who Christ says we are. And let it be a lesson that we should call other people based on the same. So we don't beat up our spouses anymore and tell them how big of a deadbeat they are, even if they are. Why? Because it's not based on their present condition. You are a good father. You are a good spouse. You are a good boss. Why? Because we get the lesson from what God did. God gave him the courage to get out of the trench because he began to call him not based on what he was, but the potential locked inside of him. Number two, so the trench is filled with fear. We know that. We talked about that. So what did God do to overcome fear in Gideon's life? Number two, God gave Gideon peace to overcome his fears. In verse 24, it shows us this. And Gideon built an altar to the Lord and named it Yahweh Shalom, which means the Lord is peace. So after God sent an angel to come down and visit him, something supernatural happened in Gideon's life. He went from a place of fear to a place of building an altar to say, man, this is the Lord of peace. Now, the fact that he built an altar stands to reason that before he built the altar, he was not feeling real peaceful. So God came to give him a peace. And we do things in our lives to adapt to the trenches. We just adapt. Well, if this is the way it's going to be, I'll just adapt to it. That's where addictions come in. That's where we begin to blame other people. We blame our friends. We blame our spouse. Why? Because we're trying to adapt to the pain of the trench. They did this in World War I. Instead of the generals and all them trying to figure out how do we get out of the trenches and fight, they begin to come up with war strategies on how do we adapt to the trenches in which we're in. And they literally the government invented an article of clothing to adapt to the trenches. They called it a trench coat. I'm serious. Trench coats were invented in World War I. Why? Because they were exposed to the cold. They built long coats to cover their entire bodies, to help it cover the exposure. They built them big so that they could wrap the trench coats around their guns, so that they were carrying all their things, so the trench coat was huge so they could cover things. The trench coats had huge pockets. Why? So they could carry their binoculars and all the things so that they could adapt to the trenches. But in their adapting to the trenches, it was debilitating them from going on to the battlefield, because the trenches were long and skinny so they couldn't run. The trenches covered the very weapons that they were intended to shoot with. The pockets that they filled with junk weighed them down, and they could never run across the battlefield because they were carrying too much baggage. And so we've got to learn how to take off the trench coat, the things that we've used to adapt to the trenches, to remove them, to remove our fears, to remove the insecurities, so that we can get back onto the battlefield. Okay, the trenches are filled with exposure. We're exposing ourselves. And so what did God do to get Gideon out of this toxic mindset? Number 3, God gave Gideon composure to overcome his exposure. Now, what's composure? Composure is that thing that kind of, it gives you a control of oneself. Compose yourself. Have you ever seen them in the movies where somebody's going crazy and they'll shake them? Get yourself together. Smack him across the face. God has this moment with Gideon. So let me show it to you in verse 14. Like, picture God shaking Gideon here. Then the Lord turned to him and said, "Go with the strength you have. Rescue Israel." He's giving him composure. And what's happening in this moment, you'll read this and go on and never even think about this, but I believe that this is one of the most integral parts of Gideon's life. That phrase right there, right there. I believe that in this moment is not a statement. I believe in this statement is God imparting something into Gideon. In this moment was an impartation of boldness. Because God says, go with the strength you have. So he had everything he needed. He already had all the brain power. He had everything. He had the strength. Whatever it was he needed to fight the battle, he already had it. Why? Because God says, go in the strength you have. So what happened in this moment wasn't necessarily him getting something, a strength or something he didn't have. God was just giving him the courage to do what he already thought he could do. God's like, I know you can do it. Get yourself together. You can do this. And God gave Gideon some crazy boldness. I mean, in chapter 8, after he gets his army together, he goes from 32,000 warriors down to 300, and he's still bold enough to go to battle. In chapter 8, Gideon walks up to one of his adversaries and says, when I return from here, I will rip your flesh with thorns and briars. What happened to this guy? He went from, God, I'm the weakest in my clan, and I'm from the weakest, I don't even know, to, I will rip your flesh off your body myself. What happened? Boldness, impartation. What happened? He just got the courage to go in the strength he had. So let this be a day where we don't ask God for more of money, or ask God for more brain cells, or ask God for more of a bank account or a better job. What if God would look at you today and say, get yourself together. Go in the strength that you have. Go with the bank account that you have. Go with the spouse that you have. Go with the kids that you have. Go with the brain cells I've already given you. It's an impartation of boldness that we're lacking. We don't have the boldness to get out of the trench. But God wants to impart that into us. And we have the strength to do this. Number 4. I wish I could preach for like 2 hours. So, like 3 of you. Okay, that's not enough. Okay. Everybody else is like, that was a golf clap, a courtesy clap. Yeah, preach another 2 hours. Okay, luckily it's 11:45, so I can't preach that long. Number 4, so the trench is filled with isolation. We talked about that. You're isolated. You're hard to reach. So what did God do to overcome isolation in Gideon's life? Number 4, God gave Gideon insulation to overcome his isolation. Now, what's insulation? Well, anybody in the construction business knows that insulation is something that comes to cover. That you put insulation in your walls to cover the pipes, to insulate them, to protect them, to keep the cold out and the warm in. So God came to bring insulation to Gideon, to empower him. This happens in verse 16. Then the Lord said to him, 5 words, I will be with you. Talk about insulation. And you will destroy the Midianites as if you were fighting against one man. You know, you've seen these war movies where they're in the trench or they're behind a barrier and somebody needs to advance. And they say, I'm going to go up there behind that wall. And they look at their partner and they say, cover me. What are they saying? I'm about to advance. I'm about to take some ground. I'm about to expose myself to a very dangerous situation. And I need you to provide some cover for me. What is God doing to Gideon? Gideon looks over at God and says, cover me. And God's like, I got you covered. Go ahead. God's there to insulate us. If anything should get you out of your trench, it's to know that you can look at God and say, cover me. And God's like, I got you covered. Go ahead. Go ahead, advance. Go ahead and take that territory. Go ahead and take back your kids for God. Go ahead and take back your marriage for God. I got you covered. You can pursue. You can go into the enemy's territory because I got you covered. I'm going to cover you all the way there. You just go ahead. This thought where he says, you will defeat the Midianites as if you were fighting against one man. I thought to myself when I read that, well, I can beat one guy. I'm not a great fighter, but I could probably beat one of them up. And I feel like the Holy Spirit spoke to me and said, the only man you need to overcome is you. Your fears, your insecurities. If you'll just step out of the trench and defeat yourself, I'll take care of the rest. I'll got you covered. I got you insulated. Just fight yourself. Fight the enemy inside, the battle that's taking place inside your mind. You just fight that one person, and God can fight the rest. God comes to insulate us. God comes to guard us and to protect us. Number 5, when you step out of your trench, you're not the only one ready to go. I'm inspired by warriors. I mean, I'm so thankful that we live in a country of people who have fought and died. I think that's why I'm so fascinated with war. Because it's hard to imagine giving my life for somebody I'll never meet, giving my life for the freedoms of those that are going to come after me. It's really hard to imagine that moment. But as I study war and as I study what happens in these most brave moments that none of us probably have ever experienced unless you are one of those men and women, and if you are, we're so grateful. And I'm so inspired by what will happen in a moment where the enemy is advancing, and the enemy, there's artillery, and there's not a whole lot of hope out there. There's not a whole lot of hope in no man's land. But so many times what happens in war is one person. Many times it's the leader. Many times it's a corporal. Many times it's a sergeant. Many times it's a private. Many times it's not a sergeant. Many times it's an usher or a greeter, or just a normal person like Gideon. Has the courage to say, you know what, I'm stepping out of my trench. I'm stepping out, I'm tired of waiting. I'm going to expose myself to the enemy. I'm going to expose myself to the bullets that are flying past my head. I don't care anymore. So many times what happens is when somebody has the boldness to step out, other people come with them. Other people are like, well, if he can do it, I can do it. If he can advance, I can advance. If he can overcome addiction, I can overcome addiction. If he can save a marriage, my marriage can be saved. And this happened in Gideon's life. When did Gideon step out of the trench? I believe it happened in verse 33. It says, soon afterward, the armies of Midian, Amalek, and the people of the east formed an alliance against Israel and crossed the Jordan. This is to show us that the enemy is not kidding around. The enemy is gathering troops to defeat them. In verse 34, it says, then the Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon. I love that thought of clothing because what I picture, maybe I'm crazy, maybe I'm a crazy fanatic illustrator in my mind, but what I picture is Gideon taking that trench coat he's been wearing and going, I'm done with this trench coat. I'm done this holding me back. And the Spirit of the Lord came and clothed him with power. And when he clothed him with power, watch what happened in verse 3. It says, he blew a ram's horn as a call to arms. And the men of the clan of Abiezer came to him. He also sent messengers throughout. And what happened? They all came. What happened? When Gideon stepped out, other warriors stepped out. When Gideon stepped out, everybody else stepped out. Fathers, when you step out, your kids will step out. When you step out at work, you're going to inspire other people to step out at work. That's what happens. When Martin Luther King stepped out, people stepped out. You're right. We've been in this trench long enough. That's what happens. It's inspiring. So we're called to step out, not to wait on other people to step out, for us to step out, for us to lead the charge.
Thanks for listening today. If you enjoyed this message and you'd like to support this ministry financially, you can do so by visiting victory.church and choosing the giving option that works best for you.